Alright, hello everybody, welcome to another Warframe video, and today I want to go over all the different status changes that have been introduced with update 27.2. Now this isn't necessarily a showcase of the power of these new status effects, it is more focused on the actual effects of the status effects. So please don't pay too much attention to how much damage things are doing. I was generally modding the weapons just so they would proc that one status effect as much as possible. Now before we go into the simulacrum and we go through all the different status effects, there is one change that's very important, and that's the removal of the 0.25 multiplier for elemental status effects. This is something that's been in the game for as long as I can remember really, and it basically made elemental status effects 4 times less likely to occur when compared to physical status effects, so impact, slash and puncture. But that has now been removed, so basically the way the game determines which status effect you're going to proc is mainly going to be affected by the amount of that damage type you have on the weapon. So for example, you now have 200 corrosive damage on a weapon and 100 slash damage, you will proc them 2 to 1, favoring corrosive. So up first we have slash. Now this one has changed a little bit, so each slash proc will now have its own duration instead of sort of consolidating it into one big slash blob. It can stack pretty much infinitely, though it will only show 10 damage numbers on the screen at a time, which is a good thing because it could get pretty messy with some fast firing weapons. And finally, while it still bypasses armor, it will no longer bypass shields, making it much weaker versus shielded units, which are mainly the corpus and some corrupted. In at number 2 we have impact, which has been changed as well. It still staggers the enemy, but it can now stack up to 5 times, and once you reach those 5 stacks it will knock the enemy down. And the final physical proc is Puncture. Now the way this one works is the first stack will reduce the enemy damage done by 30%, and every subsequent stack will reduce the damage by further 5%, going all the way up to 75% reduced damage at 10 stacks. Each puncture proc also has a duration of 6 seconds. Moving on to the single element procs, starting off with cold. So the way this one works is the first proc will slow the enemy down by 25%, and every subsequent proc will slow them down by an additional 5, capping out at 70 with 10 procs. And just like with puncture, each proc has a duration of 6 seconds. Moving on to heat, which is the one status effect that didn't change at all, which makes sense because it was reworked fairly recently, so it's still a temporary armor reduction with a damage over time effect that stacks in intensity and does more and more damage the more and more of it you stack. Moving on to Toxin, which has remained pretty much the same, though just like Slash, it now has a separate duration for each stack, which is 6 seconds. So it still does damage over time that will bypass enemy shields. And the final single element we have here is electricity, which has remained pretty much the same, so it will still stun your primary target with a shock and send out chain of lightning that will damage nearby enemies with electricity. The difference is that you can now proc electricity on the same enemy over and over and over again, even if they are in the stun animation, which was previously not possible. Moving on to elemental combo, starting off with Blast, which has been reworked completely because it will no longer knock the enemies down and it will instead reduce their accuracy. So the first proc will reduce the enemy accuracy by 30%, and every subsequent proc will reduce their accuracy by additional 5%, capping at 75% at 10 stacks, with each stack once again having a duration of 6 seconds. Up next we have Corrosive, which has changed quite a bit, so it still reduces enemy armor. However, each corrosive stack only lasts 8 seconds now instead of being infinite, and it can't fully strip away the enemy armor anymore. So the way it works is the first corrosive proc will reduce the enemy armor by 26%, and every subsequent corrosive proc will strip the enemy armor by additional 6, capping at 10 stacks for a grand total of 80% reduced armor. Now I saw quite a few people complaining about corrosive being bad and them wanting to revert corrosive to the way it was, but like, have you tried it? It's still really good. I mean, just look at this. This is a very basic unpreg setup with just corrosive, and yeah, it's not too bad now, is it? But anyway, moving on to radiation, which will still make enemies fight each other for 12 seconds if they are closer to each other than you are to them, of course, because they can still choose to fight you. However, the first proc of radiation will increase the damage they do to each other by 100%, and each subsequent proc will increase the damage they do to each other by additional 50%, going all the way up to 550% at 10 stacks. Now this isn't that big of a deal in a lot of situations because the enemies do relatively low damage to each other because the enemies are generally a lot beefier than us, but they do have some attacks, like for example the melee attack on heavy gunners that does a lot of damage even if they're fighting each other. Up next we have magnetic, which has been reworked completely, so what it does now is it does increase damage to enemy shields instead of draining them like before. So the first magnetic proc will increase the damage done to the shield by 100%, and each subsequent proc will add additional additional 25% shield damage, up to a total of 325 at 10 stacks. Now each proc will once again last 6 seconds, just like with a lot of the other ones, and magnetic procs will also prevent enemies from regenerating shields. Up next we have Viral, which has also been completely reworked, and it's basically a magnetic proc but for health instead. So the first Viral proc will increase the damage done to the enemy's health by 100%, and each subsequent proc will increase that by additional 25% up to a total of 325 at 10 stacks. Now this makes Viral actually do some very competitive damage. I mean, look at that, this is a level 150 heavy gunner and my Glaxian is just modded to proc Viral, it's not modded for best damage. So at the moment anyway, a lot of people are actually modding towards Viral across the board because it just does good damage. And finally we have Gas, the poor Gas. So each Gas proc now has a separate duration of 6 seconds and it no longer procs Toxin via the cloud. It instead does AoE gas damage around the target that's been inflicted with a gas status effect. And this is a pretty significant nerf, especially against the Corpus and other shielded units, because gas does not bypass shields. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it for the new and improved status effects. Now I know a lot of people are scared because, ooh, it's different and therefore it's ruined, but I'm really excited, I see a lot of potential with this and I think there's a lot of fun to be had here. And as always guys, I thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video and it was helpful, and I will see you on Monday. Bye bye.